Well, hey, gang, I got something different for you today. It's the 25th anniversary this year of Blair Jackson's Garcia, An American Life, the biography about Jerry Garcia, one of only a couple that have been written, and I kind of think of Blair's as sort of the definitive one. It was a great read. I really enjoyed it. It's all the things put together. I learned some new stuff, and the end is tough. It's tough to kind of get through. I got to be honest. It's a really sad ending to what is otherwise a really wonderful story. Blair was kind enough to talk to me for a second time, and we got into all kinds of different things. So I hope you enjoy the video. And without any further preamble, here's my chat with Blair Jackson about his book, Garcia, An American Life. Thanks to our sponsors. I'd like to welcome our newest sponsor, Dyer on the Mountain, to the family. I'll have links to everybody's stuff in the video description, so please do check in and support all those guys. They're all very talented artists, and it's a pleasure to have them on board. And I've also got merch for sale. Head on over to my Instagram, and you'll find your way to a pinned post where you can find out how to buy a Crazy Legs Cabs t-shirt. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again real soon. Recording. Okay. I am joined today for the second time with Blair Jackson. It's a distinct pleasure to have you back on the show. And I have to say, this is the first time that that I can say that I know the author before I started and finished a book. So that was really, really a special feeling for me to be able to read through this. And there was stuff that harkened back to our first conversation. And I just thought it deserved an episode of its own. So welcome back, Blair. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you again, Andrew.
I absolutely loved your book, Garcia. I thought it was just perfectly right down the middle of unvarnished, but also, very positive, all the good sides and the bad sides of things. I like to think I know my way around the Garcia subject, but like, for example, I had no idea that he's essentially a first-generation American.
Right. That's part of what the title comes from, An American Life, just because it has all that depth to it of being an immigrant son. And
it's a more interesting story than I expected it to be. If hopefully that doesn't sound too, I don't know how it would sound. It managed to tell this story that I know really well in a totally fresh way. And I heard echoings throughout it. It could just be that the source material was similar, or if not the same, but I heard echoings from other, historical Grateful Dead things throughout the narrative.
Well, it did come out 25 years ago this year. In fact, this will be the 25th anniversary. I was trying to figure out when it was actually released in 1999, but it was sometime in there. So this will be the 25th anniversary. So, it's been out there for a long time. And so it was pretty well researched, if I may say so. So it makes sense that people would be borrowing from it or using it as a tool to expand on their own studies, Garcia studies. So,
yeah. That's a great point. Well, let's just dive right into that subject. When did you begin the project?
Well, Garcia died in August 1995, and I think it was maybe less than a year later. I don't know the exact time. When a friend of mine named Dan Levy, who used to live out here in California, but is basically a New Yorker, and he's been back in New York for decades now. He, I guess, mentioned the notion of me doing a book to Viking Books. And they said yes, basically is what happened. I thought, oh no, now I got to do it. No, it was something that, I'd actually been toying with a notion of doing it when Garcia was still alive. But once he was dead, that certainly changed everything, obviously, and changed people's interest in it. And so I was very lucky to have a very sympathetic editor there who kind of gave me a lot of latitude. And so I plunged right in, I plunged right in and started doing interviews, which was a really interesting time to be doing the interviews, because we're talking about 1996 and 1997. So Garcia's death was still really fresh at the time, and I was kind of, just had my wish list of people I wanted to talk to. And also at the same time, I was doing things like going down to the San Francisco City Hall Department of Records and looking up things like, Garcia's birth certificate, his mother's birth certificate, which are birth certificates are this fantastic source of information. It's amazing what you can find in them, because it always has the person's name, their parents' name, where their parents are from, and all that kind of stuff. So I got a good sense of the lineage of that. And because I had, I guess you could say, a pretty good reputation in the Grateful Dead scene, having done the Golden Road for so many years, I sort of already had an entree to that world and to a lot of the people in it. So it was easy for me to say, hey, can you get me in touch with, and then fill in the blank, and usually they did. And so I wouldn't say I did it sequentially in the sense of only researching everything in order. I was always researching everything at the same time, but I wrote it in order. So I spent a lot of time in the early days of working on the book on Garcia's prehistory, and through it, I managed to find his aunt Leonore, who lived in Sacramento and had great stories about him, and his what would it be? His uncle, his nephew, Daniel. I'm spacing out on who's related to what. And Tiff Garcia, his brother, was more than open. He was fantastic. So I was just kind of crisscrossing the bay, getting all these fantastic stories, and I really love researching stuff. So I spent a lot of time in libraries, digging up things from there. And I did something, a move that I tried that happened to work out is, I contacted the newspaper up in Humboldt County that was closest to where Garcia's father died in 19, what is it, 49? I'm getting all my dates mixed up. Anyway, and sure enough, they wrote back and said, "Oh, here's a clipping. We covered it in the newspaper." So I had the in addition to all these birth and death records and all this stuff, I had newspaper clippings from that, and I went down to the Palo Alto Public Library and found a story on Jerry's wedding in the Palo Alto Times. All these things would be really super easy now, because almost everything has been digitized in so many newspaper collections. But at the time, it was like me going down to a library and literally photocopying things, or getting addresses. I went around to find all the houses that Jerry had lived in Palo Alto and all that. So I'd go look in the Palo Alto phone book for 1964, and he wouldn't be in there, but I did find some people and found addresses of places. And or I would have a map with me, an acoustic map, believe it or not. And I'd go here. Oh, here's the famous house where he and David Nelson and somebody else lived, and it's gone, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But then occasionally I would find something like, somebody would say, "Oh, I remember the address of that," and it would be the place where he and Sarah lived, I believe, in a little white picket fence house. And so I'd go there and take a picture of it and all that kind of stuff. And one of the cool sources I came up with pretty early on was one of his cousins, who showed me the famous house up in the Santa Cruz Mountains where Jerry's finger was famously cut off. So I took a picture of that, but
Oh, wow.
she made me promise not to reveal where it was, or to
Sure.
photo of because I guess she didn't want it being that. I think it was still in the family somehow.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So that was cool. It was just kind of nice to get in that environment and to sort of be able to immerse myself in that world of early Jerry. And that was so illuminating, so much fun to write too. That, when you finally get to the Grateful Dead, it's okay, well, here's something I already sort of know about a little bit. But even that was really super interesting in terms of the research, because, like I said, everybody, Jerry's death was very, very recent and very raw for a lot of people. So, like, I remember I spent like 3 hours with John Dawson, Marmaduke, from
Sure.
the New Riders, and his wife Alana. I'm messing up my names. anyway, I think that's her name. Anyway, and the tears flowed. Everybody was. I remember spending a night with Bob Braylove, the sound guy, synth specialist, and all that, and we did an entire interview in his house overlooking San Francisco Bay, by candlelight, and again the tears flowed, and and what was great to see. It didn't really surprise me, but it was great to see, is that, everybody's recollections were so fond of Jerry. I mean, people really loved him and appreciated him, not just for, his obvious musical genius, but for the person he was. And, I contrast this a little bit with, at the same time I was working on my book, Robert Greenfield was working on his book, Dark Star. I don't know if you've seen that. Yeah, the oral biography.
Yeah.
In fact, I originally wanted to do an oral biography, but as soon as I heard he was doing that, I thought, I'm going to have to write it. Which is fun.
Those were having kind of a moment in that window. I feel like there was a number of those. That great Saturday Night Live book. Do you know about that one?
Yeah, of course.
They all kind of came out right around the same time. Not to say they're not done now, but they were. It was in the zeitgeist.
Well, I'm a big fan. I still am a big fan of the form. Obviously, David Gantz and I did an oral history later.
Yes.
But, I read a book many, many years ago. It's the first really good oral biography I ever saw, which was called Edie, about Edie Sedgwick, one of Warhol's people. And it just totally opened my eyes to that art form. But anyway, what I was going to say is that, so we were kind of crisscrossing each other, interviewing people for our respective books. His ended up coming out a little bit before mine. And so we would give each other, info on sources, or, watch out for this guy or whatever. But what's interesting is, we sort of became semi-friends, I guess you could say. And later, when he wrote a regular biography of Timothy Leary, which is really good, it's a really great book. I recommend it to everyone. One of the things he says is, this is the first big project I've done since the Jerry book, and he says nobody liked Tim. It's totally opposite of, when we were both going around to talking about Jerry with the people who knew Jerry, everybody loved him, he was so great, and this and that. And he says with Tim, it's like, it was hard to find people who had nice words to say about him. So, that's the biographer's task sometimes, is to wade through that stuff. But fortunately for in my particular case, it worked out really well, and everybody was very forthcoming, and it was quite an experience just doing the interviews. So then turning it into it was, just a question of sitting down and writing. And like I said, I did it sequentially. And so it was like, thank God I'm out of the 60s now, so now I'm out of the 70s. And, it was very cathartic to me too, because it was raw to me too. And this guy had been so much a part of my life. And obviously my work life for many years too, doing the Golden Road and other Grateful Dead related stuff. And I vividly recall, after I finished the book, like literally finished the book, I think I had a good cry alone. It was just, kind of, wow.
It's hard to contextualize. Part of, I feel like what my job in documenting and archiving the interviews that I'm doing and just talking about the gear and my love of the Grateful Dead is putting it into context. And it is so hard for me to put into context how unbelievably sad it was to be a Deadhead, the second half of 1995, but 96, everybody was at loose ends for a long time. It's now in the world, that we're I guess this month, Dead and Company is going to go to Las Vegas for a residency, which if you had told me something like that was going to happen in 1996 or 1997, I would have said you're absolutely out of your mind, because it just seemed like the furthest thing, the entire Dead universe was rudderless. For a long time, and it's in this kind of like rebirth of deadheadedness right now. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to go back to that, but I really do. I what you're talking about and touching on right now about having a good cry at the end of it, and just how cathartic it must have been. It must have felt like you kind of had to get this out.
Yeah. Well, especially once I committed to doing it.
Yeah, right.
That's the thing with a book. Once you say you're going to do it, you got to do it. And, I don't want to be one of those writers who complains about how hard it is, because it's not always hard, and sometimes it's easy and sometimes it flows. But there are other times when, at the end of the day, you've maybe written 2 paragraphs 3 times or 4 times or something, and that's very frustrating. But I try not to be too much of a cop on myself. I know it's eventually going to get done. I never hand anything in that I'm not satisfied with, so I'm not going to like race through something because afraid to get that. And I didn't, and also I didn't want to do it well, let me write this part now and then I'll come back to it later and then keep going with the chronology. I thought it was really important to stay in the moment of each Grateful Dead moment or Jerry Garcia moment, and approach it that way to really, really dive in with both feet. And obviously I was listening to stuff all the time and transcribing a zillion tapes. Nobody transcribes tapes anymore, it seems, or they're auto transcriptions from digital stuff now. It was just a different world. There was no internet really, or there was no internet research. I didn't really have any. I really didn't really do any internet research on a book until Grateful Dead Gear. That was the first one that I used where it really had the full it's diving down a million rabbit holes looking for pickups and things like that. But that didn't exist in Garcia. I mean, and it, sometimes I think, if only I'd had, access to this or that. Like, I don't know if you're aware of this, but like maybe 5 years ago or something, somebody through the Freedom of Information Act managed to come up with Jerry Garcia's entire military history. It's
Oh
like,
no.
it's like 80 pages. It's incredible. And it's his commander is talking about this lazy, good for nothing. I mean, it's all the stuff he sort of said. I think he once said, I can't remember what his clever phrase was, but he had something about how it didn't work out with him in the Army. But it's funny to see that he wasn't exaggerating when he said that he and the Army were not a good fit. It's hilarious. But I wish I could have had that. But at the time, I don't know. I don't think you could even get that from the Freedom of Information Act in that era in 1999 or 1997. But I felt like it was such a victory when I got a 1-page condensation from somebody on the inside that just kind of gave me the basics of his military training and where he was, why he was just the colloquial term they use for him being discharged and all that kind of stuff. So I thought that was a great victory. Then this thing comes out, this would have been so great to have in the book. And I don't know, people said, oh, why don't you update it sometime or something? But I don't know. I think it is what it is. It's a product of that time. And it seems pretty, I go back and look at it occasionally. I'm still proud of it. And I think it's a pretty good portrait, based on what I had available to me at that time.
Oh yeah. Well, so the other subject that I wanted to touch on, in addition to just being kind of the larger, I think, sort of definitive bio of Garcia, is that so far, fair enough. It might be the best history of the Grateful Dead. Or, I'm sorry, it might be the best history of the Jerry Garcia band that's in print. Because that story is not really told in a cohesive top to bottom way,
Right.
and I think that you did a wonderful job of telling that story. And so Khan is no longer with us.
Right.
And he seemed like a fairly primary source for you. He's woven in throughout the narrative from, the very early 70s to the very end. Was that all one interview or
no, it was, I did 3 interviews with John, 3, long form-ish interviews. One was for Golden Road, which was, I think, came out during the time of when Jerry was down in 86 or something like that. And so we said, oh, let's talk to John Kahn. Anyway, he was great. And Regan, my wife, and I went over to his house, and he was a total gentleman and warm and friendly. And then I did another one by phone when I was basically writing long, extended captions for a piece in the Golden Road based around some photos where some portraits of every member of the Garcia band that Jay Blakesberg had done. So I called up each of them and did an interview with that. And I don't have that interview on it anymore for some reason. The tape is gone. But I still have the original one. And then after Jerry died, I had a long interview with him at his house, and that was, turns out, 10 days before he died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But in between there, I mean, he was, I wouldn't say I bothered him or anything like that, but I called him occasionally where I'd say, hey, I'm doing a roots story about this song. What do you know about how that came to the Garcia band or whatever? And he was always very open about answering that stuff. He was very friendly and nice, just a really sweet guy, I thought, which was, so I was always kind of, I was always kind of surprised when there was so much kind of negativity about him, which was, I think, mostly, because they blamed him unfairly, I think, for being, Jerry's drug source or his drug buddy, which I guess they were drug buddies. So what? But that I don't think, it's not like he twisted Jerry's arm to be part of. They were like best friends, really close. And like I said, John was a really nice guy. I really liked him a lot. So, but yeah, so that's that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the book is the approach to the Jerry Garcia band and sort of the detail, the granular detail, really, with all of that cast of characters, from the Merle, and Bill Vitt incarnations. It's sorted out a lot of questions I had about the chronology of the piano players, Nicky Hopkins, how he fits into the story. And I mean, really, it was the problem of, I've been in bands myself, and it's hard to find, if a key person leaves, it's hard to find a replacement, and so that totally contextualizes how the sound of the group changed.
Well, if you're looking for granular detail on Jerry Garcia's solo projects, my buddy Joe Jupil, who's a professor of something esoteric in Colorado, he's been working on a Jerry book for years, and it's basically done. It's called Fate Music, and it's only about Jerry's solo stuff. And boy, does he have the granular detail. I mean, he's been working on it for years, and he got all the business records, every contract that he ever signed. It's going to be amazing. And so I'll pre-plug it. Even
wow, yeah, that's cool.
Probably a couple of years away, but it's very exciting because he found everybody who's still around, which unfortunately isn't as many people as were around when I was working on the Garcia bio. I mean, Bill Vitt. I mean, just Merle. I mean, there's so many people who have died since the book, even that I talked to.
Yeah, I mean, the book, to go back to what you were saying earlier, I feel like it's a product of its time, but it almost couldn't get written. I mean, I'm not a biographer, but it seems like the access to obviously the key people who are no longer with us. So having those things on the record is essential.
Yeah.
But landscapes, things, all kinds of things change. Palo Alto is a completely different town now than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, right.
I mean, the Bay Area has had all kinds of changes just since the 90s. It's amazing. I mean, Garcia checked out, I think, the day that Netscape IPO'd. There was some amazing, basically it was like obviously the internet had been around for a long time, but it really blossomed in the second half of 1995, and then it led us to where we are today.
It's changed everything. And like I said, even though a lot of people won't have access to the same people I had access to, which is a shame, they have access to more stuff through the internet than I ever did. And more people are coming out of the woodwork. More people are writing their memoirs, so that, you wouldn't write the same book that I wrote, but somebody could write an equally good and great book about Garcia, and I'm sure somebody will, not just Joe Jupil, but somebody will do a bio like mine that will be great. And I mean, that's what historians do. I mean, you don't have, if you're writing about Abraham Lincoln, you're not going to find many
primary sources.
But of course, one thing you will find now, if you're doing a book on Abraham Lincoln, is scanned versions of like everything that was ever written, every letter he's ever written. So they, in a way, the researcher's job is easier than it was when I was doing it, but in terms of sources, maybe not so much.
Yeah, we talked about Garcia band. We talked about sort of the topology of Jerry's life and the biographical aspects from the beginning. But the beast of the Grateful Dead is very tidily addressed throughout as well in
Right.
in all lights, favorable, unfavorable. I think again, kind of an unvarnished. I mean, just for example,
Right.
the there's some nuggets that I won't spoil for the readers, but you know how Keith's tenure at the Grateful Dead ended.
Yeah.
The anecdotes that are in your story are different from what I had heard before.
Yeah.
And you know, those are questions that I always had. Why did this end? And as a matter of fact, that last performance in Oakland in '79
Mhm.
it is pretty good. It's
Yeah.
it's it's a different version of the band than had been around leading up to that. They
Mhm.
didn't sound as road weary. They busted out a bunch of songs.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Keith's departure alone, I feel like there's a book in just that subject. You know.
Well, I don't know if there's a book in that, but I actually have toyed with the notion of doing just a thing on the keyboardists, sort of doing
Mm.
the definitive Pigpen, Keith, Brent histories and all that kind of stuff. If there, I don't know if there's a market for it. We'll see. I don't know. The Grateful Dead market is not what it once was, even though they're more popular. I think there have been so many books at this point, and so much stuff has come out that I think publishers are a little more wary than they were 20 years
Yeah.
ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, sticking with the topic of piano, Bruce entering the story, that was kind of when I entered the picture with the Grateful Dead. So that's stuff that I read with great detail.
Mhm.
It was fascinating. I of course I knew he had his own career, and I knew his, but it didn't make sense to me that his scheduling conflicts were the defining factor of where the band was going, and
He was more popular than the Grateful Dead for a while. I mean, in terms of mass popularity, he had a couple of really big hit singles and stuff like that, which the Grateful Dead had one. Yeah, I mean, it was an amazing sacrifice for him to play with the Grateful Dead at all. I think, but it was so sort of necessary. It turns out, in retrospect, just to have that kind of solid, confident anchor in the band at a time when they were kind of casting about, saying, what are we doing? We've just lost one of our rocks. So I mean, he's such a nice guy too. I mean, he was in it for all the right reasons. He loved Jerry, obviously, and I think what he brought to the Grateful Dead, even though it occasionally sounded kind of cluttered, was amazing, and I think it has stood up well too. I kind of love hearing those '91 shows where he's kind of rattling along in the background. He's just, he's so cool.
yeah, it's like having a well-trained member of the audience get plucked out of the crowd and put on stage. You know, that
Right.
that knows all the material and can really shine. He really, I'm sure that's my own bias because I know his story now so well.
Mhm.
But that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like somebody who genuinely loved the material
Yeah.
and slotted into it in a really wonderful way. The there's a discrepancy. Maybe that's not the right word. Jerry cast some pretty serious shade on Brent after the fact, where he's talking about how he's from the East Bay and there's very
Right.
little culture, and it sort of
I mean, Sharon
disrupts.
saying that. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of
Yeah.
disrupts the bromance that the photo record would leave you. I think I don't know. I'm fascinated by Brent Midland. He seems like a very enigmatic character to me, and I think you kind of draw that out in the story.
Well, I don't know. Um, I don't know what to say about Brent. I mean, I think Jerry's right in a sense that he was from a different world. He was a different culture, and it's not just because he's from that part of the East Bay, which is a lot more conservative and kind of lily white and all that kind of stuff. Um, but he was not an intellectual person, and that's not a criticism. It's just a statement of fact. And Jerry knew that, and everybody knew that. And so what he brought to the band was kind of grittier and more kind of soulful, because it was that's the part of himself that he was expressing. And but culturally he was from a different world, and he was not from the acid world. So he had to sort of catch up on all that. I remember when I interviewed him for the Golden Road, he kind of was bemoaning the fact that he had sort of missed out on all that. Even though I think he said he was in a band that played like Morning Dew and the Grateful Dead arrangement of Morning Dew and a couple of other things. But it was definitely a culture shock for him, I think, to be in the band. And I don't know if it's fair to say that it might have prevented him, not having that background, it might have prevented him from progressing in quite the same way in some kind of, in Space Jams and stuff like that. But I don't think he was as good a fit in that environment as somebody like Keith was, who was very trippy and kind of loved the jazz stuff that was kind of a natural fit with the Grateful Dead, the jazz approach that was a natural fit with the Grateful Dead. But
Yeah,
I'm not bad at Brent. I'm just saying that I agree with Garcia, and he would know better than I, that they were from different cultures and a different world to a certain degree.
Yeah, this has been said a million times, but he kind of was this amalgam of like he could cover the Donna vocal arrangements basically exactly the same. He could play sort of to the Pigpen thing with the Hammond and with the the voice.
No, absolutely.
And it was and the 3-part harmony that they generated,
really good,
was really good. Yeah, but it was a little more triad based chords and I don't want to say anything pejorative because I love his playing. Those years are some of my favorite parts of the Grateful Dead to visit.
Absolutely.
Did you one thing having and this is where kind of like the me having a chance to get to know you a little bit before I read the book was interesting because you had told me the story of like taking the trip to the 83 New Mexico shows. And so I was like, oh yeah, he was at that. Right. Did you find you had a bias for certain parts of the story from person? Did you have an attendance bias from certain parts of the story, certain performances?
Yeah, I didn't talk that much about specific performances though. Yeah, I mean, you can't help but be influenced by what you saw. And so, I mean, part of the reason that maybe it's as ebullient and enthusiastic as it is because I had such a great time in the 80s and even in the early 90s when the shows weren't nearly as good. And so my enthusiasm is and doing the Golden Road at that time, which was so fun. So, I think that kind of enthusiasm is maybe reflected. And as for a time bias, one thing I would say is that, and then this is even true of McNally's, super well-researched book, What a Long Strange Trip. So, people tend to just kind of not even write that much about the 80s Grateful Dead. The 60s is where they came from. It's what everybody's most interested in terms of the culture at large. It's San Francisco, flowers in your hair, acid rock, and it's very natural to be super into that time period and to write about it, and it's fun to write about because it's so colorful. But in terms of there are more Grateful Dead fans who came up in the 80s and early 90s with the band than followed them in the 60s by a long shot. And so to give short shrift to that time period didn't really make any sense. And so I was pretty conscious about I'm going to give the 80s their due. For better and worse, because obviously that's when Jerry starts having his health issues and their drug issues and all that kind of stuff. But, in terms of the trajectory of the band, it was, everybody was having such a great time in the 80s at those shows at the Greek Theater and, wherever, Alpine Valley and Merriweather, there were just a million places where they played, where they sort of developed their following just by playing great shows and everybody having a great time at these things. And it's really I think the evolution of the whole Grateful Dead Deadhead phenomenon is really most in the 80s by nothing's even close. So,
yeah, I would agree. That's really when it codified itself into what we know it as now.
Yeah. Traveling to see the band,
Yeah.
Which didn't really happen that much in the 70s, or there were a few people and a few tapers and stuff like that who would say, oh, we're going to go to Binghamton and Albany and we're going to go down to Virginia, but not that many, not compared to what happened later when there were more of us who were sort of older, wealthier because we worked.
Yeah.
And would say, oh, okay, well, let's go down to Long Beach for the weekend. And
Yeah.
so we'd go stay in a pretty nice hotel or whatever, and see the Dead in Long Beach, and then whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Red Rocks. Yeah.
Yeah. That right. You do a good job of putting the reader in the room, in those rooms, and the Frost, all those places. The Greek, contextualizing the Greek, for example, of the the rise to the mid '80s, and they get too big, they can't go back, and now they're stuck at, I guess, the Oakland Coliseum or Shoreline, which is 40 miles south of San Francisco, which is a big deal. I saw the Dead. I saw the last California performances at Shoreline, and to me, it was like getting across this like golden finish line of making it all the way.
95, you mean?
Yeah, 1995.
Those were my last shows.
I was 19 and on my kind of great hegira of seeing the band myself as best and as far and wide as I could. And for being a young buck, I got to see them in the South and in the Midwest and on the West Coast, and then the last California performances. And
you probably went to more places than I did. So
maybe, I don't know. Did you go to the 91, or I guess the 90, the first long run of shows at Madison Square Garden, where the gorilla was on the marquee?
No. Oh, you mean with Bruce and Vince?
Yeah.
No, I did not. My first Madison Square Garden shows were 88.
Okay.
Is that right? Yeah, I saw them at Brendan Byrne in 84, I want to say. Then I saw them at the Madison Square Garden 88 during that run where they did like when they had guests come out, like they did that whole rainforest thing. Yeah, I didn't see that show, but I saw a couple of the shows there. And then I saw them. The last East Coast shows I ever saw, I guess, were in 94 at Madison Square Garden. Dylan showed up one night, which was interesting, but not very good.
Yeah.
And that was very depressing for me. It was depressing to see that those shows. Yeah, they were not good.
Yeah, the fall of '94 was. I saw a bunch of shows on that tour, and it was a hard time. It was. I feel like it's taken me a long time for just. I'm a guitar player, and I am self-taught from listening to Grateful Dead music and seeing the band and knowing that tail end part really well when Jerry was really sloppy for years. I thought it was okay to be sloppy because my favorite guitar player kind of was a little sloppy, But then when you go back and listen to the precision in his playing in the darkest of times, the show that always springs to mind is Augusta on the fall tour of '84. He's got the long, stringy, greasy hair.
That was his worst look ever.
It's just, not great. But the playing is transcendent, and the book does a fantastic job of abutting those two things together, where you have the good and the bad. And that's the thing about the Grateful Dead, I think, is the sunshine and the darkness co-joined.
Well, the thing about the darkness in the early 80s, like when he looked so bad in 84 and seemed like physically unhealthy and stuff like that, was that they still tended to play really well. It's different from 93 to 95 because he didn't seem to have those same kind of mental lapses where he'd like forget lyrics in 3 different verses of a song, and just kind of seemed to zone out. So that that was more worrisome than him physically being immobile on stage. What I often think about this is that, for a while there were no real good video documents of the earlier Grateful Dead. There wasn't YouTube to find things on. The Grateful Dead movie hadn't been re-released yet, and all that kind of stuff. And I remember when the Grateful Dead movie finally was re-released, or even looking at stuff like the 1980 video stuff from Radio City Music Hall. If you didn't see that for a while, and then you saw them, what sort of the way he looked in the mid 80s, and you're like, holy shit, that's barely the same guy. He was so bouncy and lively and all that kind of stuff. And by 84, he was just kind of standing there looking. It was somewhat worrisome, but I don't think anybody was thinking that, oh God, Jerry's going to die or anything like that. So
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, some of that stuff has almost become a meme on the internet of like
Yeah,
the Duke 78 trucking where he's doing the windmill. The first time I saw that, I was like, I had heard about it before I had seen the actual evidence myself. And I thought, this has to be bullshit. And sure enough,
yeah.
there you see
Well,
it. And it's a totally different level of animation.
yeah, I remember the first. I think was it the Duke show, or maybe it was one of those other. I think 78 shows was the first time I ever saw Jerry like going into the drums. It's like, what are you doing? What did this really happen? There he was like banging on stuff back there.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that in the book too. I had a bunch of dog-eared stuff. I mean, I thought it would be kind of mundane for me just to be reading parts in the book. Remember this? Wasn't this great? I like that Saturday
It is
Night Live.
25 years old.
Yeah, well, so I had read.
So a lot of people have read it.
I had read McNally's book when it came out, which was going on 20 years ago, and kind of thought that was the first, middle, and last thing I would ever need to read about the biography of the Grateful Dead, because he kind of covers everything. But again, somehow I found stuff in this book, and it teases out all the things. I have one specific question that every time I look at the book, I'm reminded of, is the Blakesburg cover shot from, I think must be late 93 or 94. Was that your editor's choice? Was that, did you pick out that picture?
I picked out that picture.
Why that
one? Thank you for asking. Because I don't know. It was, they originally, they proposed a cover to me, which was one of the Baron Wolman photos from 1969, which are fantastic vintage Jerry. I mean, he's like in a black t-shirt, and I think he's going like this or something like that. And they wanted that. And I said, no, I want something more recent. They have more fans recently. I don't want to do the 60s thing again, because everybody does the 60s thing. And Jay had given me a bunch of photos, and I don't know, there was something about that just seemed kind of mysterious. And he's looking right at Jay, but you can't really get past the glasses to know what he's thinking. But it's so Jerry, though. There's something about it. And so and they went along with it. Yeah, so that was cool.
It's a great choice. I mean, it makes it's a beautiful thing when you can read something and feel like you're an audience of one, because that's Garcia that I knew. That's the guy, the round glasses, and a little, maybe doesn't really look like he wants to be there. That was the vibe I kind of got seeing the Grateful Dead. Sometimes it was great. That's why I kept going and driving all across the country. But it wasn't the same thing as this smiling 87 Frost, say, Jerry, who's just goddamn glad to be alive,
Right.
After the coma. So the cover really speaks to me in a really profound way.
That's good.
Yeah. The coma. Well, I knew when I got to that part that it was going to be pretty heavy and interesting. What a period. I had of course heard people talking about the subject of Jerry's playing fundamentally changing after his diabetic coma. And I just thought it was like a wonderful sketch of that, how the band came back, and the jams were different, and his playing really is melodically and every way, the improvisation is fundamentally different after the coma.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you're a musician. You would know that better than I do. It did feel different. It felt less wandering sometimes, maybe, and more concise. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. Some people thought, well, after the coma, he didn't explore some certain tonalities or certain things as much as he had when he was not doing so well. But it was such a great time to be a Deadhead. I mean, to have the rebirth, essentially, of the band, and to see the kind of enthusiasm on stage that they literally didn't even have like in the 60s. I mean, I think he became this guy who was kind of smiley and gesturing, don't raise your hand, and don't lend your hand to wave no flag atop no ship of fools. Know? I mean, we were kind of staggered by it in a good way. I think it was a really sweet period for the band, because everybody felt the same way that we as the audience did. It was like, it's great to have like the old Jerry back, and it really was the old Jerry back for quite a long time, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, that's the era that I kind of got to love the Grateful Dead. I was 12 years old when the Touch of Grey video hit MTV, and at the time I was kind of watching an awful lot of MTV.
Yeah.
And my dad liked the Dead, and we would listen to Skeletons of the Closet on long road trips that we took every summer. So I knew a version of their music, but then this totally different thing came at me through the coaxial cable of MTV, of his guitar that looks a little spooky. It has these points
Yeah.
on
Right.
it, and these guys are older, but they're the end when they become real. There's this. It has all these elements that really spoke to a 12-year-old. It was, having watched the Muppets going all the way back to the 70s. It had elements of, yeah, absolutely. Elements of that. And there was the jovialness baked into the cake as well. And it was just absolutely perfect. Again, it felt like it was an audience of one, although in the case of Touch of Grey, it certainly wasn't, because it fundamentally changed the fan base.
The scene definitely had that Muppetoid chaos to it too. The backstage was always kind of frantic and strange and all that. And Gonzo, you're going on now. Ah!
Really? Huh? That's interesting. That's what I love about. I feel like, Henson and those guys, I think we're all cut from sort of the same cloth. There was a zeitgeist of the late 60s that's sort of intellectual post-beatnik. I'm sure there's a more articulate way to put it than what I can muster the words for. But they all kind of remind me of one another in a weird, desperate way,
Well, Janice, the bass player, was a lot less spacey than Phil is, though. No, more spacey. I mean, actually,
yeah.
He's more
Right. I don't know. I Blair, I really enjoyed this book. If it's not evident by now after talking about it for 40 minutes, it came along at a point in my life right when I needed to kind of reinvigorate a lot of this thinking, and I just thought it was a fantastic read, and I hope a lot of other people are able to get as much joy out of it as I did. It's a sad and it's a happy story. It's like the story of life. It's got all the elements in it of immigration and the band forming and all the wonderful things about the Grateful Dead, and the sad things too. The kind of allows you to kind of meet your hero without having to actually meet him. I mean,
right. Well,
I'm
a thing I sometimes tell people is, when they say, well, is it too devotional or something like that? And I think, no, I describe it as fond, but not fawning. So I don't know. Maybe that's accurate. Maybe it's not. I mean, I didn't right in the intro. I said I'm a fan. So, and there were critics at the time who sort of took me to task for that. Well, this is a book by a deadhead. That kind of thing. Well, okay, yeah, but I thought it was important to have that perspective, and from a, it's just. I thought it was important to have somebody who was there write it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that to have somebody that is not a deadhead, that would have to get completely spooled up on all of this material is a tall task. So having a familiarity with all the moving parts, I think is what makes it what it is.
Well, it was interesting. I got so much mail from people who only saw them in 94, 95, and then subsequently got lots and lots of mail from people who never saw them at all, and it seemed to speak to them, which is great to hear, that somehow I connected with something that now that they've become fans of the music, they can relate the stories to how they hear the music, and that's what a good book does, and hopefully it brings you into something that you can't experience any other way. In this case, it's telling a story, and I don't know. It was extremely satisfying experience all the way around.
I'm glad to hear it. Well, I have to say it was, as I already have intoned enough. It was a delight to read, and it's a favorite subject of mine, and I feel like I know the guy a little more clearly now.
Cool.